Okay, so back to this. So what can you tell me to light on the girl? She is side lit, right? So we have a mix match of lighting here. That's why I gave you guys two different files. The file that Annie picked to actually put on here, it's the wrong girl. This girl has got really hard side light, contrasty light. That would be light if you imagine the sun sort of 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Although in the winter where we're in right now, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Anyway, it's a side light, and the two don't match, and they never will match. So we need to actually get rid of that. So what I'm going to do, if you take a look at this, she's got shadows in here, she's got check layers, control stuff, all that kind of stuff. We need to get rid of everything except for the background. So select the thing that's called Shadow 1. It's the second layer. Scroll all the way up to the top, hold down your Shift key and click the Color Check Layers group and hit the Delete key. You should end up with nothing but this door scene. Did that work for everyone? We good on that part? Select the layer right above the door called Shadow 1. Scroll all the way to the top, hold down your Shift key, and click the very top layer group. Everybody should be highlighted now except for the layer at the very bottom. Hit the Delete key. All you're left with is the layer at the bottom. So we need to then open another file to actually bring in the correct figure. So to do that, Command O to get your open dialog box. Navigate to your assignments folder that you got here in this class in the very beginning. Click on the assignments for class for session number 9. And inside, sorry, why is this not highlighted? This is so weird. Let me do students. In your assignment folder for session 9, so session 9, assignment folder, there are two composites that are already knocked out in there. One of them is the girl in yellow that was the wrong one. The other is the girl in black. That's the one that you want to open up. So I'm not going to keep asking you guys if you're on. If something happens, you can't find something, whatever, just shout out and tell me to stop, and we'll get you there really quick. But I don't want you to hold off on stopping me because I want you to be able to actually physically do this. This is all about muscle memory and actually going through all the steps. Is everybody good with that? All right, so last time I'll ask, does everybody have this figure open? Okay. In my case, I've got them, my files are separated from another. If you've got tab behavior going on, you need to pull these apart because what we need to do is we need to be able to see them both at the same time, and we need to be able to drag the smart object of the girl on top of our door situation. So if you need to, pull the tabs away from where they're docked up at the top so that you've got discrete images. Make sure that the girl, the silhouette of the girl in black is actually selected. Click on the layer that is the girl and drag it on top of the image that is the door frame. Hold down the Shift key and let go, and it'll put this actually in the very middle. It says that the target has a different bit depth. Do we want to? Just go ahead and say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and continue. It looks like Anna, he's working in, yeah, this is a problem, and I'm just going to point this out to you guys really quickly. She's working in 16-bit right here, but she's only using Adobe RGB. I don't know that there's a real advantage to that. It just makes her files twice as big, and everything that we try to do on them is going to take twice as much time. But other than that, we're good to go. This is still a good place for us to actually start. So does everybody have these two things together? Okay, you can close up the version of the girl that's just by herself. We don't need that anymore, and we don't need a file sitting inside of Photoshop taking up resources that we're not really working with right now. So the first thing we need to do is actually scale this image. So mine came in and she's sort of like standing where she is at the front door. So with the composite body actually selected, we need to transform it. We need to make her smaller. So Command T will bring up the transform dialog box. If you click on the link between the width and the height up in the options palette up at the very top, it's this little link thing right here. If you click on that, it actually locks the ratio of width to height so that we can maneuver any of these handles and not distort the girl. She will always stay, if we reduce her height by 10%, her width will also be reduced by 10%. So we simply need to click and bring her down in scale. You can also click inside the box. You want to avoid the anchor point right now, which is in the middle, but you can click in the anchor box and we can move her around. And what I want to do is I want to put her foot right on that threshold step. I don't want to put her foot down on the ground right now because I'm trying to scale her relative to the door. Now, a typical door in the world is 7 feet tall. This girl is close to 6 feet tall. So we can probably bring her up a little bit, but not a whole heck of a lot more. She is now scaled in proportion to the door. Make sense? So I'm going to go ahead. In my case, my scaling was 84.25%. That's how much I reduced her. I'm going to go ahead and click the check mark to say OK to that. However, I don't want her standing up on the threshold. I want to put her down on the ground. So I'm going to hit the V key to get the move tool, and I'm simply going to set her down on the ground so that she's like right in front of that threshold. In doing so, she's a couple of inches closer to the camera. That might make her slightly larger by like a half an inch, but we would be splitting hairs right now if we thought that. But she's now scaled in proportion to this image, and now we can actually start to work with it. So the first thing that I do is check the background because I know what's happened with this girl. When she was shot in the studio, there was a color card there. She is color balanced. Her exposure for that space is balanced. I don't know if it's going to fit this scene, but anyway, I know that that part is good. What I don't know if it's good is if that's what happened to the door image. So it is a smart object. I'm hoping it's actually got raw data in it. So if you double click on the background that is the smart object, hopefully it'll bring us into camera raw. It is, so that this actually is raw data. It looks like it's from a Sony. So my first move is to color balance this. Now I don't have a color card in here, but I do have something in here that I know should be neutral, and it is the door. So I'm going to click on the little eyedropper in the basic panel right next to where it says white balance. I'm going to click on that eyedropper and come over, and I'm going to click on part of the door that I know should be white balanced. And you see it just put a bunch of warmth into the door as well. The importance of this is that if I know that the color of the girl is white balanced based on a solid card, and I know that the door is also giving me that same white balance, then my colors are the same. And I don't have to go through that effort of trying to match colors. Or at least if I do, it's going to be really minor. It's not going to be some major thing. So this will actually get me where I need to be as far as that part goes. Make sense? However, the thing that nobody that I know of at Columbia Colleges ever seems to ever do is we need to check on what the exposure on this is. Come up to the top right under your histogram and click on the word auto and just see what it does. It brightens the entire scene up. Personally, I think this looks better. It's less underexposed. So the scene to me when I was looking at it was cool and underexposed. That also is causing me problems because the girl is color balanced and properly exposed. So I need both of these. Does that sort of make sense what I'm going for here? Now, once I get the composite built, I can make the whole thing dark and moody. I can make it blue. I can make it nighttime. I can desaturate. I can do a million things to it. But putting them together, I need them to be the same, and this is the easiest way to do it. Are we good on that part? Okay. So go ahead and say okay. So Vivian, are you Mac or Windows? I need to give you a set of files to work on. Say what? Here, I'm going to give you this anyway. There's a folder in there called My Copy or Copy My Composites, something like that. What was it called? Copy Me Composites. It's a folder. Copy the whole folder over to your desktop. we're going to keep going on this one, but then you're going to start on the next one with us. It's that plus 2 more folders. So, okay, so this is where I'm actually at for my setup right now. I'm going to go ahead and select the body on top, so I've made her active. And now I'm going to run my check layer part. And you can already see that things are a little bit better together here. They're not perfect, but they're a little bit better together here as far as all of that goes. So in your actions palette, you need to find your check layer action and make sure that you're not selecting the check layer group, the thing that looks like a folder. It's the first of the tiers that says check layers. You don't want to check anything inside that check layer part, because what'll happen is your action will start somewhere in the middle of the action instead of running the whole thing. So click the parent part of that and then run it by clicking on the arrow that points to the right. And usually your image should end up looking like this. So does everybody have this sort of like psychedelic, way over saturated color looking thing? Okay. If you look over at your check layers, you've actually got 4 of them. There's 2 that are sitting at the very top. One is a hue saturation and one's a color fill. Those 2 work together. If you turn off the hue saturation, you'll see the color fill is actually stripping out all the luminosity and just giving you the color of the image. The reason I have added a hue saturation layer is that this gets to be very subtle, and so when I'm going in trying to color balance, it's a very subtle thing that I'm looking at, too subtle for me. So if you click on the hue saturation, then it's much easier to see, for instance, that the coat is dominated with blues, that the face is dominated with yellows and reds, and that that's also what's going on in the background as well. So those 2 operate in tandem, but this is not where we start. So turn both of the eyeballs off on that. Underneath that color fill layer is a saturation check layer. We will get to that eventually. And underneath that is where everybody always starts. You want to start with the luminosity check layer. So click to actually turn this on. And now we need to look at this image and make value judgments about the image. So when I look at this image, what I feel like is that right off the bat, the figure is way too contrasty. Imagine if this was a black and white photo. There's no way with this big, general, soft overhead light that those shadows would be as blocked up as they are right here. That simply would not happen. Don't you agree? All right, to fix that, this composite is a smart object, and you want this to be a smart object to do this kind of work. Some people will try all sorts of tricks to get rid of the contrast in here, but there's only one way that works really, really, really well. And so to do it, come up to your image menu, down to adjustments, down to shadows and highlights. This is a smart filter. It should be in the filter stack, but it's not. So again, image, adjustments, shadows and highlights. And immediately when this thing opens up, if you have a very abbreviated small dialog box, simply click on the show more options at the bottom of it and you'll get everybody else. By default, when this thing opens up, it lifts the shadows. That's all it actually does. So if we use our preview to turn our preview on and off, you will see that that is not happening to this smart object. So hang on. That was happening to the smart object underneath it. So make sure that you've got the body selected, and then run that image, adjustments, shadows and highlights. And you'll see that the girl opens up quite a bit. Now, in my feeling here, she's opened up too much. We've gone a little bit too far the other direction. So to fix that, you grab the amount slider of the shadows up at the very top, and you start dragging it to the left. You're going to start to decrease it. And we're bringing back in a little bit more shadow or a little bit more definition part, whatever. Now I ended up with around an 18% if you want the same thing that I've got. If you use your preview on and off, you can see sort of like what we're opening up. And this becomes more believable to me. So this is where I'm going to go with this. I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. Again, it's a smart filter. So when I turn off my check layer, my luminosity check layer, I may have to go in and adjust this guy. I may have overshot it. So I'm going to turn off the luminosity check layer. And I'm looking at this, and my feeling now is that this whole thing needs to be brighter. My background is a little bit brighter. She needs to be a little bit brighter as well, and that is not that shadows and highlights. The shadows and highlights is strictly designed to open up shadows. So in this case, I actually need to brighten her up. I'm going to turn my luminosity check layer back on again. I'm going to make sure that the girl layer is active, and now we need to actually add our first adjustment layer to deal with the luminosity. To do that, you click on an Add Adjustment Layer, the circle that's half black, half white at the bottom of your layers palette. Click on that, come up to Curves. It'll put a curve right above the girl. The problem with this curve right now is that if you click on it, you'll see that it's impacting the entire image. I don't want to impact the entire image. I just want to impact the girl. So if you hover your cursor between the curve and the smart object, so take a look at my screen to see where I'm at, hover your cursor right between these two and hold down the Option key, you will see that you get a little box with an arrow going counterclockwise. And if you click that, it'll actually clip. This is called a clipping layer now. It will clip this curve to the girl. That's what that little downward arrow pointing is. If you take a look at your Properties panel, that same little icon sits at the very bottom underneath your histogram. You can actually do it here as well. So you can clip it and you can unclip it. In our case, we want to clip it so that when we use this curve, it only impacts the girl and not the rest of our scene. Now, I said I need the girl a little bit brighter. To actually make her brighter, you do not want to grab the middle of your curve in here and drag it up. What happens when you do that is that your highlights are still locked where they are. They haven't moved. You've only lifted the midtones in this, and that's not our problem. Our problem is overall exposure. So I'm tearing that point off. Instead, I'm going to grab the corner point up at the very top right. This is my white point. I'm going to click on that and drag it along the top in the front. And what you'll see is it'll actually start to lift everything proportionately. This is more like an exposure raise. Again, when I get to this stage of the game, I like to turn this on and off to see, do I believe this is my new image? Do I believe this? Does this look like a good solid black and white image? It might be a little strong for me, but we'll see. I'm going to turn off my luminosity check layer, and then I'm going to turn this girl on and off and say, does she fit in this space? Does she belong in this space? And right now, I think the color part is throwing me off in this space. So until we deal with all of that, I'm not really going to know. So we're going to move through our next set of check layers, and we may come back and drop the amount of opening up that we just did. Matter of fact, I'm going to drop it back a little bit right now because I think it's just a little bit too hot. That feels a little bit better to me. So if you want the same output that I've got, my curve has an input of 236 and an output of 255. That's actually the curve that we've actually put on to brighten things up, lighten things up a little bit. My next one is going to be color. So if you go up in your check layers group, you want to select the top two of them, the hue saturation and the color fill. And what we're looking for here is a general feeling about the coloring in our frame and the coloring of the figure. And you can see that our background is dominated by warm tones. So all of these orange, yellows, red tones, it's dominated by that. Unfortunately, the outfit that the girl is wearing is dominated by blue tones. It's exactly the opposite of what? And so that's causing a color mismatch in this. Oh, I needed to change one other thing here really quickly. That curve that we put on there to raise the luminosity that we clipped, that is a luminosity correction. We don't want that to correct anything else. So to do that, make sure you've got that curve selected. Change its blending mode of the curve from normal down to luminosity. It's a subtle change, but you can just see the color of that figure changed as well. Everybody good so far? All right, so we need to actually adjust the color of the figure. So we need a new adjustment layer that we're going to put on top of that luminosity adjustment layer that we just made. So to do that, come down and click on Add Adjustment Layer, and we are going to add Color Balance. We are going to clip color balance again to the figure, either by clicking on the little icon at the bottom of the properties panel or by holding down the option key and hovering between those two layers and getting that little sign, so that now when I do a shift in color, it will only impact the girl and not the background. So what we see in this is a dominance of blue. If you take a look at the color balance properties panel, you'll see there are your primary colors, RGB, and then there are your secondary colors, CMY. They are complements of one another. If I have too much blue, you can see I can fight the blue by adding yellow. Again, these are complementary colors of each other. Too much blue means we add yellow. So click on the yellow slider and just start to pull it towards the left. And you can see right off the bat, that blue starts to shift into green and sort of like warmer tones that are matching some of the tones that we've got around here. I'm going to keep pushing this a little harder and see if we can't get it to pop just a little bit more. And I'm not really getting any significant change in that as I keep pushing forward. I'm just making it more yellow. So I'm going to pull this up just to the point where it gets pretty green in there. And now with this amount of green in here, you can actually try to add a slight bit of magenta, because again, I'm trying to get to some of those more warmer reddish, yellowish tones in there. I'm going to grab my magenta green slider and click on it and start pushing up a little bit towards the magenta side, but not by much. I mean, this thing takes off pretty quick. So if you want the same color that I've got yellow as a -20, indicating that it's going to the right, to the left, and then I've got a magenta of a -8. So that's looking to me much, much closer in this game. So I'm going to turn off my color check layers, both of those. I'm going to go back now to that color move that I just made, and I'm going to turn it on and off. And you can see it's a very subtle thing, but look at what it did to her coat. Instead of having all that cold blue light on that coat, it's actually now got this warm light on it that's matching all the warmth of that brick. So this part's actually looking pretty good to me. I'm feeling pretty good about this guy. Finally, I'm going to do my last check layer, which is the saturation check layer. So if you click on it to turn it on, what happens in saturation is that any place in your image that is dark is lacking saturation. Any place that's in your image that is light has saturation. So if you had something that you were looking at right now that was pure white, that would be 100% saturated. And if you had something that was pure black, that would be 0% saturated. So anyway, when I look at this image, it seems just a little bit too much saturation in the color of her face to sort of match what's happening with all the brick. So our final adjustment layer, click again, the color one that we've already finished, make sure it is active. We're going to add one more adjustment layer to this. So again, click on the adjustment layers, and we are going to add a hue saturation slider on top of that. So you can see, before we do anything else, again, you need to clip this so it only affects the girl, and you need to change the blending mode of that from normal down to saturation. I need to check and make sure I changed the blending mode. I did not change the blending mode of my color layer, which was a mistake, so I'm going to go back to it really quick and change its blending mode down to color, and then go back to my hue saturation layer and have and basically tweak this. It needs to lose just a little bit of saturation. So I'm going to grab the saturation slider in the middle and start to pull it down. You'll see her face is getting a little bit darker. It doesn't take much. I don't need to go hog wild on this. So I ended up with a -13 on mine. And then I'm going to turn off my saturation check layer. And this is where I'm at right now. And I think if you guys take a look at this, this is completely believable now. No? So, last thing that we need to do is a couple of shadows on this. So scroll down, select your background, the one that's on the very bottom. We need to actually put our shadows between the figure and the background. Now, people have been putting a lot of shadows on top of the figure. You can do it, but the problem that you run into is that any shadows that go on top of the figure will actually lay on top of, so if I'm putting shadows like around her shoes, it'll actually lay on top of her shoes. Whereas if I put the shadow underneath the subject, underneath the figure, whatever, it is impossible for them to actually impact the top of the shoes. So that's why you put it on top of the background, but underneath the girl. So I'm going to add a blank layer underneath that. I'm going to double click on it and call it Shadow 1. Then I'm going to hit the G key to get to the gradient tool. As soon as I hit the G key, I can look up at my gradient that's up at the top, and I can see it's not, my foreground and background colors are not standard colors. So hit the D key to default your foreground and background colors to black and white. In the type of gradient that's up at the top, you need to click on the drop-down menu and open up the Basics folder of gradients and pick this one that's in the middle, which is foreground color to transparency. So that's why you see this black corner going to the checkerboard. That's foreground to transparency. Then finally, the type of gradient. If you look at the 5 little icons that are just to the right of that, you want to pick the second from the left. That is a radial gradient. And then working on my shadow layer, simply click and drag down, and it will give you this blob of black on your screen. Hit Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. To get our handles to work in unison together, I need to crush this thing. I need to reshape it is what I need to do. And to do that, if I simply click on the top handle and drag down, it just moves down, but the bottom handle doesn't move up. So I'm distorting the top, but not the bottom, and I need to do this evenly. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. And instead, hold down the Option key and click that same handle and come down. And it will also bring the bottom handle in. Now, you can move this. The trick to moving this, though, is you want to stay away from that anchor point. If you get too close to the anchor point and try to move something, it'll move the anchor point instead of your shadow. We want to move the whole shadow. So I'm going to click pretty far away from that and simply drag and bring this thing down underneath the girl. And I'm going to come down to where it's sort of like sitting pretty well underneath her. It's still looking too big to me, too tall. It needs to be more narrow. So I'm going to hold down the Option key and continue to crush that down and narrow it down a little bit. It's also spilling a little too wide left to right. So I'm going to hold down the Option key and click on the handle that's on the far right side and bring this in just a little bit. But you don't want to come in too much because I still need that area sort of like right underneath her to be pretty full. And I'm going to go ahead and hit the Enter key. At this stage of the game, if you have a tablet, it'd be a really good thing to turn it on and use it. Right after we actually do that transform part, you want to hit the E key to get the eraser. And in the eraser options, you want it set up like this. You want it to be a brush mode, an opacity of 100%, and a flow of 6. And you also want to make sure that this is a soft brush. So I'm going to take it all the way down to be a soft brush. I'm going to make my eraser a little bit larger. And then you need to eliminate the shadow that's on both sides of her feet because there's nothing that would explain the shadow that is actually wider than her body. So I'm going to get it off of this side, and I'm going to get it off this other side as well, and probably a little bit in the front right there. So this is my first shadow, but it is way, way, way too dark. So take the opacity slider of that, of the layer, and start to drag it back until the shadow becomes much, much, much more faint and much more believable. So, and you would be surprised how little it takes. So mine is around a 36%, and you can see that's what it's actually adding to this, which is quite a bit. I need to do 2 more shadows really quickly, so I'm going to click and add another layer above that. I'm going to call that Shadow 2. Hit the G key to get a gradient tool. I'm going to actually zoom into her feet now. I'm going to click and drag out a smaller gradient. Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. Hold down the Option key and crush this. Then I'm going to, hold down the Option key and crush this. I'm also going to rotate this now because I'm building the shadow to go under that right foot. So I have rotated this thing slightly. Now, and that looks about right to me, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes to this. Hit the E key to immediately get the eraser and get rid of the shadow that's right in front of her toe. There is nothing that would be able to explain that. And this is now the shadow that I've actually added that's underneath that foot. That part works out pretty well for me. I'm going to bring it down just a little bit. You can use your hit the V key and then use your arrows to bring it down a little bit. It'll actually give it a little bit of the darker part behind it. Now that part works a little better for me. One more shadow. So I'm going to click on the add another layer, double click on it, call it shadow 3. Hit the G key to get the gradient tool, click and pull out, Command T to get up a transform, hold down the Option key, crush this, and also make it pretty narrow. It's going under her other toe, which is pretty small. And I'm going to bring that up. Again, I'm going to continue to make it much less wide. And if you have trouble placing this because you've got all these control handles around it, you can hit Command H, which will hide them, but still let you move this stuff around so you can it's still actually working for you. So my feeling is it still needs to be more flat. So Command H will bring those things back. Hold down the Option key and crush it down even more. And then I'm going to go ahead and accept that. And then hit the V key to move it, put it up into place. Hit the E key to get the eraser and make it smaller and get this off the sides. There's no reason there would be that kind of shadow on the sides. Double click on the hand. So at this stage of the game, I'm going to go to my history palette. I'm going to hit snapshot and say okay to that. I'm going to scroll all the way up to the top, and I'm going to click on what the image looked like when Anahi made hers. That's what it looked like, and this is where we are right now. Which of those is believable to you? Is this making sense to everybody? What happened? Did this work for those of you who did it? Okay, seems like a good time for a break. So I have got, we'll call this 2:40. If you guys can be back at 10 minutes to 3, I really want to get as many of these done as I can get you guys to go through, because I think if I can hit all of these bases repeatedly enough, it'll really begin to sink in, and you will be able to do these flawlessly. Are we okay on that? All right, so I'll see you guys at 10 minutes of 3.